Today we are talking about Transcendence and Jotunn's Wrath. We'll also factor in Hydra's Lament in addition to that a little bit, but those are the two primary items we'll be discussing. The context of this is early item builds for junglers specifically. As a jungler, you will start with Assassin's Blessing and you will build your power boots or your attack speed boots in some cases, and many CDR junglers typically will go into Jotunn's Wrath after that. Or that's at least what they used to do for the longest time. Then some other build strategies came up where you'd rush in early Brawler's Beatstick for more damage, or go into Hydra's Lament to maximize your damage that way. Depending on the character and the playstyle, there were multiple options. But Jotunn's Wrath was always kind of there as a core option that would allow you to get a lot of cooldown reduction relatively quickly, tied with some power and some penetration, which all in all would result in a heavy damage spike at that point of the game. Now with Season 5, Transcendence was changed. The change was described as follows. Transcendence is a staple high physical power item, giving a large portion of mana and physical power for heavy ability users. With this single focus it was okay, but it was difficult to justify building this over more flexible items that gave complementary stats. We're adding a cooldown reduction to Transcendence to make it more attractive compared to other power items. The change itself was a simple addition of 10% cooldown reduction to an item that prior to that had no cooldown reduction at all. And that's a very interesting change. Now why is that? Because Transcendence previously was an item that wasn't really considered for jungle. And that's for a good reason. Transcendence had a decent amount of power on it by itself, but really not that much else that was beneficial for a jungler. MP5 was something that wasn't highly valued because junglers could build Bumba's Mask, which had a decent amount of mana sustain by itself, and then they could also build a starter item for more mana sustain. So overall, most junglers really didn't have to invest into MP5 or flat mana much. That was also part of the reason why Jotunn's fell off a little bit. Only a select few junglers would really use the mana part of it. Outside of that, Transcendence just didn't have the benefits to cut it for the jungle, as stacking Transcendence still takes a decent amount of time, and if you want to get the full effect out of the item, then you will have to stack it. So when the choice was there between a just high power item that requires stacks to be fully effective and one that was super effective right off the bat, that was more revolving around cooldown reduction and would allow for much more early aggression and higher kill potential that way, people would choose Jotunn's Wrath. And later in the game there were often just other choices that made more sense than Transcendence, especially once again because you kinda wanna have it stacked ideally as well. But things have changed since. And not only in the context of the change to Transcendence, but also in the context of the meta. One of the important things to realize is that the new Assassin's Blessing is relatively limited when it comes to mana sustain. Most other blessings provide you with a lot more MP5 or mana or some sort of mana sustain at least than Assassin's Blessing will. And as such, we need to look for other options. Now, Traveler's Atalaria is an option obviously, as it also provides you with MP5, but often enough you don't want to invest into that necessarily if you can avoid it. And it's also not always enough MP5, interestingly enough, even though it's such a high value. You have to keep in mind that with the jungle respawning a lot more often and a lot of junglers having to clear on their own, you will need a lot more mana to clear the jungle as fast as possible. Literally every move you make through the jungle can be made quicker if you have mobility abilities that you can use mana on, and then every clear of every single camp will also go faster if you have more mana to use all your abilities all the time. And as such, MP5 and mana are a lot more valued on junglers than they were before. But it doesn't end there, because if that was all there was to it, then everyone could just build Hydra's Lament for the extra mana that's on that item. In order to understand the changes a little better and how much of an impact they will have, let us look into the numbers. In order to do that, I've compared the damage values on a Thanatos level 10 using his 1 and his 3 on an Awilish level 10 and the ultimate later in another combo as well as some basic attacks. The item build that is used is Assassin's Blessing, Warrior Tabi, and then either Transcendence, Jotunn's Wrath, or Hydra's Lament. Thanatos scaling values are not the highest in the game. His 1 scales with 60%, his 3 with 70%, and his ultimate with 80%. So as other gods that do scale a lot better can get more benefit out of Transcendence. This is worth pointing out at the start. But overall I felt like he was still a very representative character who can make use of all these items under different circumstances, and as such does seem useful for this comparison, as some other gods, for example, don't make such great use of Hydra's Lament. or on the other hand are way too strong in terms of scaling and just overwhelm every other god when it comes to scaling, so they benefit from Transcendence way too much. Think for example Thor. Looking at the raw damage values for the abilities here, we can see one thing very clearly, and that's that Jotunn's Wrath comes out on top initially. That's due to the fact that it's the only item here that has flat penetration added to it, meaning every ability will deal more of its base damage to the target as well. So the one with Jotunn's Wrath deals 348 damage, with Transcendence it deals 332 damage, and with Hydra's Lament 322 damage. However, when Transcendence is fully stacked, which is an extra 22.5 power, then the damage difference is a lot smaller already, because then Transcendence has a damage of 342. So overall it doesn't fall off that much in damage once it's stacked. Then the secondary damage of the one, which is percentage damage, will also deal more damage with Jotunn's Wrath, obviously, as that's the only item here that can change this value as its penetration, and the damage from the one is not true damage, but still physical damage. With the 3, we see a different picture already, and that's because Jotunn's Wrath does give you that penetration, but Transcendence scales better with the extra scaling that it has over the 1, and actually ends up dealing more damage up front already. Jotunn's Wrath deals 119 damage, and with Transcendence you deal 124 damage. This is due to the fact that the 1 was on rank 5, where it has a lot of extra base damage along with the scaling, whereas the 3 was on rank 1, because you want to level the 2 after the 1 and you only have 1 point in the 3. So this doesn't really amplify much through penetration, as the base damage value is kind of low, and the scaling will have a bigger impact here. And we see that continuing. Hydra's Lament obviously once again the last light basically, but Transcendence fully stacked going up to 141 damage, much above anything else here. The basic attack, which scales with 100%, is obviously gonna hit hardest with the items that give you the most power. Jotunn's Wrath has a little bit of an edge over Hydra's Lament again because it has the penetration, with Jotunn's Wrath comes in with 115 damage with the basic attack, Hydra's Lament is 107. Transcendence, however, starts at 124 already and goes up to 141, simply due to the high scaling of a basic attack. Even the Hydra's Lament amplified basic actually doesn't go much beyond Transcendence damage. Whereas Transcendence has 141 as its max damage, a Hydra's Lament basic will deal 149. Not an insane difference here. The ultimate, once again, we have a higher scaling, we have 80% scaling, Transcendence comes up on top. At this point, let's look into some combos as well. If we use the 1 plus a basic attack, in case of Hydra's Lament, this will always be an amplified basic attack, assuming you always use the basic attack after the ability and get some extra damage. We end up at 564 damage with Jotunn's, 555 with Transcendence, 565 with Hydra's Lament, and 577 with Transcendence fully stacked, so it already is the highest damage here. In a combo with a 1 plus a 3 plus 2 basic attacks, the picture shifts only for Hydra's Lament, which benefits from using the additional basic attack, and the more abilities and basic attacks you use, the more damage Hydra's Lament will obviously deal compared to others that don't get that amplifier constantly. In a combo with a 1 plus 3 plus the ultimate plus 3 basic attacks, Transcendence fully stacked still comes out on top and still has more damage unstacked than Jotunn's Wrath. Hydra's Lament once again falls somewhere in the middle. Now, what we have to keep in mind is that these items don't have the same price. Hydra's Lament is by far the cheapest with 2,150 gold to its name. The problem with Hydra's Lament, even though it has such a high damage value, is that you have to perfectly basic attack cancel all the time, and it's just not gonna happen, and sometimes you're just gonna throw in basic attacks in between before using an ability. In all those cases, Transcendence or Jotunn's will simply give you more damage. You just have to completely rely on the cancels with Hydra's. With Jotunn's Wrath you pay 2,350, which is still a bit lower than Transcendence, which comes in at 2,600. Also, you have to keep in mind that Jotunn's Wrath still has 10% more cooldown reduction. So a god that definitely 100% relies on cooldown reduction might consider going into Jotunn's Wrath before Transcendence still. But overall, I think paying 250 extra gold, but getting so much more out of it later into the game due to the extra scaling that you get for every bit of mana that you get towards late game as well, is definitely worth the investment. That little bit of CDR that you lose is something you can easily get back from other items, and the synergy with Transcendence is much better too, as you will be able to, for example, build it with Hydra's, and it will always deal more damage with Hydra's, as Hydra's once again scales with your power. In terms of mana, Jotunn's Wrath is beaten by Transcendence by a mile. Jotunn's Wrath has 150 extra mana, where the Transcendence has 300 mana and 6 MP5, which is usually overall even way more than Hydra's Lament can offer. And that means you can clear so much more in the jungle, you can get so much more farm that the 250 gold are easily made up for just by you having to backlate in many situations. As such, I think taking a minimal dip in your power early on and a minimal dip in cooldown reduction and compared to what you get later into the game is now absolutely worth building Transcendence first, because even unstacked it is such a powerful item now. You can still build Penetration later, and you can even still consider building Jotunn's after Transcendence, but I would generally prefer Transcendence right after Boots just to get those stacks out of the way to make it as powerful as possible as quickly as possible. As far as I understand it, the change was not aimed at junglers and assassins primarily, but rather at hunters, and I feel like it kinda went overboard and Trans got so good that it's better almost to be picked up by assassins right now, which is an interesting change. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're new to the channel, feel free to get this up and ring the bell, it really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out. So I actually figured out my demonetization issue and it was my outro. As such, feel free to click any of the links around here right now. There will be new outro music as soon as I find something nice. Until then, as you guys requested, I will do the outro music myself. You're welcome.